Like
That my comment.
every things are also water. I can't. Therapists, but with a license, just. That's what they yelled at us. Bunch of. I'm just going to call for it. It's all beating on.
Yeah.
Really more like. Every week we have.
Yeah, it is.
Better semester, but.
I don't know, I just tried. Since I'm only two.
Yeah, well, you just live like a mile away from them. My aunt and uncle, they live next door. Oh. I was like 69.
All right, folks, we'll get started in just a couple more minutes. Gonna give people time to filter in, come in from classes, all that good stuff.
Yes, somewhere. Speak about it.
Trying to get.
Action 22.
time from 8 to 5. Thank you for unmiking me, or for unmuting me, I forgot. I'm just thanking people for those of you on WebEx. So thank you to everyone, and come by and enjoy that display. All of April will have it up in the PCC Library. If you don't know where that is, it's right across the street from here on the first floor. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Professor Mattarocci. Professor Mattarocci has been an instructor at Pueblo Community College since 2011. He currently teaches composition courses for the English department and the GED Language Arts and Social Studies sections. He holds a bachelor's in English and history with a minor in psychology and a master's in English. His emphasis is neo-historicism. He analyzes literature in a historical frame, exploring the historical context in which literary works were created. He was first introduced to the Titanic in the 2nd grade while writing a book report. However, his interest in the event did not take hold until he was 8, and he saw the 1953 film starring Cliff Webb and Barbara Stanwyck. Since then, he has spent several decades researching the tragedy in the White Star Line, gradually building a collection of original White Star artifacts and reproductions. His master's thesis explores how literature and popular culture have transformed Titanic into a representative character. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mattarocci to the stage.
Those of whom have had me as a professor before, you were about to see something that you wish to see a semester or more. For the sake of audio clarity, it's going to come off. Okay. Okay. Thank you all for turning out today. I really appreciate this. So we're not going to do a basic Titanic 101. So we won't get into the forensics of her death and things along those lines. We're going to look at Titanic from a much more critical lens. So one of the things that fascinates me as a scholar is the mutable nature of this event. So there are two Titanics in essence. There's the physical Titanic that is resting at the bottom of the ocean, and there is the symbolic, the iconographic Titanic, which has been divorced from its actual historic incident. It becomes a symbol for anything and everything. When someone tells you it's like the Titanic, what types of things come to your mind? Catastrophe, disaster, human tragedy. And it becomes a comment on much more than that. Do we think of classism? Yes. Do we think of gender roles? Yes. Does it become a symbol of technological failure? Yes. And so what we're going to be doing today is we're going to use the tragedy as sort of a case study. Because we're doing this in conjunction with the library, we're going to be working on some information literacy skills. So we're going to explore this in a critical lens and look at it from a critical thinking standpoint. So we're going to look at 4 different things we should be doing as scholars. And when I talk about scholars, am I talking about just big scholars? Are all of you scholars? Every single one of you in this room? Yes. You go out, you do research, whether it is in an academic frame or in your everyday life. You find research. And so what we're going to talk about is how to strengthen those research skills. 4 things that we should be looking at. Looking at the importance of context, looking at the importance of cause and effect, looking at getting the entire picture and all of our data, and learning how to divorce fiction from fact in this process. And Titanic is going to function as our case study throughout the entire course of this discussion. So for those of whom came in here hoping that you would get the Titanic 101, I do apologize. Hopefully I can do something far better in this process than that. So let's begin with our first skill. If I get in the way of this, please let me know as well too. All right. So let's talk about context. So everything and anything is created in a context. That text message you sent someone 3 hours ago, that email that you're sending someone, a historic document, everything occurs within a given context. And typically it occurs within social context, historical context, and textual context. So why is it important for us, not just as scholars, but as everyday individuals, to look at the context of something?
Understand its importance.
Understand its importance. You can answer my questions, they're not rhetorical. It's a trap. It's a trap, don't do it. It'll make you do homework. So to understand things, in essence. So let's talk about cultural context. So cultural and social context involve the beliefs, the behaviors, the practices, and the values of societies and groups of individuals. And all of our cultural contexts are different in this process. So let's look at an example. You're going to a job interview here in the United States. What types of things does your employer or your potential employer expect of you? Do they want you to shake your hand? During the interview, do they expect you to maintain eye contact throughout the entire course of the interview? And if we don't maintain eye contact, what kind of happens to the interview? It goes down, it tanks in essence, right? And so in Western society, especially in the United States, is eye contact a big thing? I'm doing it right now, right? I'm scanning around the room, I'm looking at every single one of them. Eye contact's a huge thing. Maintaining eye contact becomes a symbol of respect. But what about in Japanese culture? Is it viewed as vulgar and rude to stare at someone? And so what we want to do in this process is we want to understand the cultural and social context surrounding whatever we're exploring, whether it's a document, whether it's an event, whether it's an artifact, whether it's a piece of news that we've gathered up. And we should never impose our own cultural understandings on the cultures of other people.
I have no idea.
Try to feed into that. All right. So, why is it important that we never why is it important that we never force our cultural understanding on other people's cultures? You're not understanding their culture. Is there anything wrong with maintaining the ideology that strong eye contact over extended periods of time is bad? No, it's not. So we want to take the cultural context into consideration. What different elements are playing into the information that we're gathering? We also want to take the historical context into consideration. Every historical time period has its own behaviors, beliefs, practices, and values. And what's wrong when we try to force a 21st century perspective onto something? It goes down. Yes, it goes down. Exactly, right? So let's look at another example. The way that women behave in 21st century United States and the way that women were treated in Greco-Roman society. So if we know our history, what is the life of a woman like in ancient Greece? Is she the property of her father? Yes. Does her father find her a good potential husband? Does she then become the property of her husband? Is she educated? No. Does she have any rights to any property? No. Can she voice her opinion? Must she be chaperoned 24/7? Yes. Her father must chaperone her, her husband must chaperone her, her brothers must chaperone her, and her sons must chaperone her. And depending on what part of Greece that we're looking at in ancient society, some of these women also have to go into different rooms whenever men come to visit them. Ladies, is this? No, this is completely different. So what is wrong with taking our current understanding of gender roles and forcing it into something 2,000 years old? It doesn't work because it takes things out of their own context, in essence. Is it forcing an interpretation that should not be there? It does, yes. So we want to read things within our historical context. And the other thing that we want to do in this is, should we ever dismiss these contexts as wrong? Do we all grow? Do we all mature? I know every single one of you has at least one chapter in the book that is your life you would not want to read out loud. We all grow and we all mature. As a society, do we hopefully grow and mature from our mistakes? Are these contexts part of that maturation process? Yes, they are. So we want to make sure that we read things within historical context. We also want to make sure that we read things in a textual context as well. Every single document makes its own distinct argument. So if we are looking at the different arguments as far as why there should be or should not be universal health care, we have the two big camps, right? So we're going to have a pro side and we're going to have a con side. But we also have smaller camps within the pro and the con. One might say we shouldn't have universal health care because it might lead to too many taxes. Another might make the claim that we shouldn't have universal health care because it will lead to the lack of patient rights. They're making a big argument, but the context of the argument itself is unique to that document. So why is it important that we never take things out of their textual context? This is the meaning of it. And we can think of some examples of this. Certain books and documents that are cherry-picked in this process. We only look at one chapter or one passage, and we use that as the representation of the whole. And the problem with this is by using it as the representation of the whole, this isn't the whole picture. It may negate what's going on in the entire course of the rest of the document. And by forcing this type of understanding, we take apart the document in an improper way. So let's look at two specific things with Titanic. And let's read two events in their cultural and their historical, and even in their moment of context. So let's start talking about some of what we're familiar with. So why were passengers not willing to get into lifeboats? We have this image, right? You have families standing at the lifeboats and they're forced to separate. Husbands and wives are forced to separate. Children are forced to separate from their fathers. And beyond the trauma of that specific event, is there more going on with this? Yes, so let's talk about the context, because we need to understand not only the cultural, not only the historical, but also the context of the moment itself, so that we can get a better grasp of exactly what's going on and why passengers were so reluctant to get into these boats. So the first one we're going to talk about is what's going on in Edwardian society during this time period. So for most of Edwardian society, the lifeboat is still viewed as a death trap. Prior to 1900, about 16% of every ship that left port never reached its final destination. For many of Edwardian society, the lifeboat was viewed as a means of suicide. We like to think of the Marconi and the wireless systems, but at this time, they were novelties. They were commissioned by the shipping company to entertain the super wealthy. They were under absolutely no obligation during that time to send or receive any messages for the ship. Wireless operators did this out of the kindness of their heart. In their contract, it did not state that you had to actually send or receive messages for the ship. And most ships did not have wireless because it was a new system, and if you were an older ship, you weren't capable of holding it. So for many of our Edwardians, once you left that ship, there was very few means of communicating distress. You might have had rockets, you might have had Morse code lamps, but that was it. And so if you leave this ship and this ship goes down, is there any possibility that you might get rescued? Maybe, maybe not. And so for a lot of Edwardians, the lifeboat was viewed as a death trap. Passengers would get into the lifeboats, they would go away from the ship had very few means of communicating distress, and if you weren't rescued immediately or within the next couple of hours or maybe even a day, you drifted at sea until starvation set in, thirst set in, or everyone went crazy and killed each other. And for Edwardians, this hung very heavy in their minds. In 1893, Neuronic ended up disappearing without a trace. 2 months later, her lifeboats were found floating 200 miles off of her known course with no one in them. So for Edwardians, this idea of getting into a lifeboat, rowing away from the ship, was questionable. Why would you do this? But we also need to talk about what else is going on with our Edwardians as well, too. Technology. Our Edwardians are living in a society that has had almost 100 years of technological progress. They have seen revolutions in technology that many of us would never dream of today. The inventions of automobiles, the inventions of wireless. We have trains, we have ships, we have advances in medicine, nursing, psychology, all of this stuff. And for many of Edwardian society, technology became this image of the ability for man to conquer nature. And it bred within Edwardian society this blind confidence in technology. Humanity and humanity's technology was a thing that could squelch and put nature in control. And if any of us know anything about Pueblo history, How is the veil? Have we been downtown? What was the veil billed as?
Fireproof.
Fireproof. And if we know our Pueblo history, what's the veil fireproof? No. Is anything fireproof?
No.
Is anything unsinkable? No. But for Edwardian society, they had in this mind this sort of blind confidence that technology itself could rule the world. And do we kind of have a blind confidence in technology now? All of you have little things sitting in your pockets, or you're playing with them as I'm talking. You have very blind confidence. ChatGPT is really changing the world in this process. So for the Edwardians, they have this confidence in the ship itself, which means we need to talk about the context of the event, the moment. We've talked about our cultural context, our historical context. We also want to talk about the moment of itself. And I know looking back on it 111 years later, it's easy for us to say, I would have gotten the nano. You couldn't have paid me money to stay on this. I would have bought people to get into a lifeboat. But we're looking at this from hindsight. We know what is going to happen. They do not. Many of them have been woken up from a sound sleep. They've been told to put on warm clothes, don this life vest, and go up on deck. And they go up on deck, and it's cold, it's dark, it's noisy. The smokestacks are blasting steam from the boilers because they don't want them to explode. You have crew members yelling at each other to try to uncover the lifeboats. And you turn around, and you see these warm decks. All of the lights are blazing. The band is playing in the lounge. They're serving drinks. People are laughing. People have gathered in the gymnasium are playing on the equipment. John Jacob Astor is taking apart a life vest to show Madeline, his wife, how it works. And then they tell you you're going to get into this 30-foot little boat. We're going to row you down 50 feet to this dark, black expanse of an ocean. And you're going to roll away. How many of us would have done that? How many of us would have got in that boat and rowed away? How many of us wouldn't? Many of us wouldn't. And that's the thing that we want to take into consideration. So the first lifeboat 7 leaves the ship at 12:25, and it has only 28 people in it. It can hold 65. And for the longest time, most of these passengers are not willing to get into the boats because of what's going on, the context of the situation. It's warm inside this ship. The decks look stable. We have a blind confidence in technology itself. It doesn't seem like it's the point getting in it. But slowly our context begins to change. Because at this moment, most of these people don't know that in 2 hours, Titanic will be gone and 1,500 people will be dead. But by about 1 o'clock, things begin to change in this process. Passengers ascending the forward grand staircase are able to look down 6 flights to the E-deck landing and watch as the sea slowly creeps in. Gradually, the landing will disappear. Water will pour out of the elevators into the D-deck reception room, pick up furniture, and swirl it around in the current. It is a sobering sight. For many, the reality of the situation is beginning to set in. Titanic is sinking. And over the course of a half an hour, the conditions on the boat deck are going to deteriorate completely. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who has already misconstrued Captain Smith's orders of women and children first to mean women and children only, has now begun only accepting children into Lifeboat 11. By the time that it leaves the ship, it has over 70 people in it, and it can only hold 65. Survivors talk about being able to reach their hand over the gunwale and touch the ocean only a few inches away. And in reality, it should be 2 to 3 feet above them. So family members are forced at Lifeboat 11 to make a very stark decision. You either save your child and orphan them at the same time, or you stay together as a family and you hope that you get put in another lifeboat or a rescue ship comes. Lifeboat 13 gets caught in the discharge from one of the pumps. And as the crew is trying to break the tackles to free them from the ship, Every passenger in the lifeboat begins screaming in horror as they realize lifeboat 15 is lowering on top of 13. Further forward, an unknown officer has shot 2 passengers before turning the revolver on himself. And amongst the chaos, there are about a dozen dogs freed from their kennels. We think it's John Jacob Astor who did this, who are running up and down the deck. Everything from a Great Dane to a French Bulldog. Our context has now changed. People are now fighting to get into these lifeboats. And so it's important for us to understand things within the context itself. It's easy for us to say, I would have gotten in that boat. But at the very beginning, would you have? The other thing that we want to look at in our context as well, too, is let's start to explore the steel debate. So in 2008, Dr. Phil Laley ended up publishing an article. He did 10-year research based off of fragments he had been given on Titanic steel. And what he found was this steel was very high in phosphorus, sulfur, and oxygen, which made it extremely brittle under extremely cold conditions. And so for us, it's oftentimes easy to go, well, Titanic was built with inferior steel. But we need to read this within the context of the actual period itself. So if we look at the research of Davies, he shows that between 1909 and 1911, the years in which Titanic and her sister Olympic were built, there were 2 predominant ways of producing steel. There was the Bessemer way, which produced very high nitrogen contents, which created much stronger steel. And there was the open hearth way, which produced less nitrogen and a weaker steel. David Colville and Sons, who provided Harland and Wolff with all of their steel to build these ships, used the open hearth process. However, Harland and Wolff was not known for producing garbage ships. Harland and Wolff was known for being one of the premier shipbuilders of the era. So why are they using inferior steel? Or is our definition of inferior a 21st century definition? It is. What is wrong with taking the policies of modern medicine and using them to justify why medieval Europe was backwards?
A lot more research.
There's a lot more research to this. Have we learned a lot in this process? Yes. And so in 1909 and 1911, these were the primary ways of making steel. This was what the industry knew at that time. So while it's easy for us to look back at a 21st century perspective and say Titanic was inferior, the problem with this is, have we taken this out of its historical context? Have we applied a 21st century understanding of technology and steel forging into a 20th century? The interesting thing about Laley's argument, though, is if you ever get a chance to read it, in the conclusion of his document, he makes this claim. He talks about how, even though the steel is inferior by 21st century standards, in 20th century standards, it was the prime steel of that time. And Laley even talks about the dangers of taking things out of their context. But as many of us as students and professors and even just lay individuals, do we usually read all the documents sometimes? Oh, do we sometimes neglect some things? Yes. Do people usually neglect the conclusion of Laley's document? They do. Laley's document frames it in its historical frame, and oftentimes when people cite this as a discussion of Titanic's inferiority, they forget to take into consideration that even the person who released the study itself talked about it needs to be kept within its context itself. So let's talk about one last thing when we talk about context, and we'll move on to our second information literacy skill. Let's talk about the fire in coal bunker number 6. This is oftentimes paired together with our inferior steel argument and to build into the whole event itself. So on April 3rd, it was discovered that in coal bunker 6 in Titanic, there was a fire. And crew were put on a round-the-clock mission to extinguish this. They end up doing this 10 days later on Saturday, the 13th of April. And a lot of people make the claim that this was a sensational, insane thing, that White Star Line kept this secret and they didn't tell the passengers and all of this stuff. But we want to look at this from the context of the event itself. How many chemists do I have out here? No chemists. is cold dust combustible. It's insanely combustible in this process. And so this is not a unique thing to Titanic. In fact, this is a common thing aboard most ocean liners at that time. There's a specific process that you must go through in order to load the coal. So you load it in stages. You load a couple of feet, then you wet it. Then you load a couple more feet, and then you wet it. And you try to keep it as wet as you can so that you prevent any type of combustion in this process. So it was not just Titanic that had coal fires. Many ships had coal fires. In fact, the New York City Fireboat Brigade was well trained in how to put these out. While I won't say that it was a common occurrence, it was not uncommon. They were aware of this, they know how to do this, and most crew aboard ships knew how to take care of this situation. And so if this is not a rare occurrence, would most of our crew not have been too concerned about it? Not too much, no. But it oftentimes gets paired together with this. It may have contributed to the weakening of Titanic's steel. The high oxygen and phosphorus and sulfur content may have done this as well too. But when we start to do this and take these things out of the context and we don't look at the full scope of it, we don't get the full picture in this process, which is kind of what we want to talk about next. Let's talk about our next information literacy skill. Let's talk about the importance of cause and effect. Why is it important for us, whether it's a student, whether it's a scholar, whether it's just your average everyday individual, to get the entire picture of a story? You lose context in this process, right? How many of you have ever got stuck in the middle of a fight with friends? And it's two friends pitted against each other, and one gives you one story and the other gives you a completely different story, and you're now stuck trying to figure out which one you're actually getting the truth from in this process. It's important for us to understand that we need to get the entire picture when it comes to anything that we encounter, whether it's a scholarly work, whether it's a news article that we get on Instagram or Facebook. And part of this includes looking at all causes and effects. So I'm going to ask you a question. Is there only one reason someone develops an illness? You got to diagnose them, exactly there. And when we diagnose them, we look for multiple causes. So could many things contribute to someone getting cancer? Could it be your diet? Could it be your genes? Could it be your lifestyle? Could it be the amount of stress that your job causes you and you go home every night and cry? Yes. I don't do that. All right. So there are multiple causes. So what is the problem with saying this is the cause of this? It's two-dimensional in essence. Does it sort of boil everything down into just a basic concept? Does it remove the minutia of what's actually going on in this process? Could there be multiple causes for our issue? Could one cause be more significant than other causes? Could our causes occur in a complex web that all interact with each other that bring about? Yes, exactly, Jared. And so when it comes to this, we want to understand all of the causes that are occurring during this phase, because everything is going to build into each other. Oftentimes, it's very rare when we have one cause and one cause only. We also need to look at the effects. So I'll ask you another question. Does a treatment for an illness have only one outcome or side effect? If you go to chemo, is that going to have one outcome? No, there's multiple outcomes. Are all of our outcomes going to be purely good? Are some of our outcomes going to be negative? Are some of our outcomes going to be a hybrid of the two, partially good, partially negative? Are all of our consequences going to solve the problem, in essence? No. So why is it important for us to look at the multifaceted nature of effects as well as our causes? Trying again, Brian. So we see it in the third dimension, right? So we're seeing it, the whole picture in this process. So whether we're scholars, whether we're just average individuals, we want to make sure that we are getting the entire cause and effect. What is truly causing all of this? And as we do so, we want to make correlations, but we want to make sure that we're not falling into the trap of poor correlations, or fallacies. Let's bring some Latin into the equation. So none of you knew we were going to talk about Latin today, right? Post hoc ergo propter hoc. What the? Who's gonna watch it? So this is a fallacy. And what post hoc ergo propter hoc does is it says that we have two incidences. We have A and we have B. And because A is closely related in time frame to B, A is the cause of B. We see this a lot in superstitions. So let's say hypothetically that I played baseball in high school. And let's say that during one of the games, I wore green socks. And during that game, I went to state. We went to state. Are you seeing where we're going with this? Wearing green socks, going to state. Are my socks now lucky? Am I going to have to wear those green socks to everything? Yes. And not wash them because they're going to smell horrible and no one's going to want to be around me. And then if I have an entire baseball team that are all doing the same exact thing. So what is wrong with doing this post hoc ergo propter hoc?
You can't think outside the box, you can't think anymore.
You can't see anything outside the box. With our superstitions or even my green socks, if I don't wear those green socks, is the world going to come crashing down?
Yes.
Exactly, yes, yes. Every single time. That's why we're wearing them right now. So have we formed sort of a poor correlation between this? And what we want to do as scholars in this, and even just as average individuals, is we want to make sure that we're not falling into the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. We want to make sure that we're not creating correlations that don't exist or correlations that are founded on poor reason or poor logic. And we want to make sure that our sources are not doing this as well too. Are our sources looking at things logistically? Are they exploring all of the causes? Are they exploring all of the effects? And are they reaching a reasoned conclusion about why something has happened and the importance of that specific thing? So let's look at two more things with Titanic. So let's look about this one. You knew it was coming. This is the one that everyone talks about. So why was steerage locked below? We have this image of third-class passengers kept behind with gates, left to drown. And so we want to start talking about the whole picture in this process. Yes, many passengers were kept below decks. However, there were some individuals who made sure the passengers did get up to the boats. Pantryman Albert Piercy was standing at a doorway between both third and first class, leading passengers up. Stewart John Hart testified in both of the court hearings that there was a door between second and third class that was opened and left for people to use for access, but no one took advantage of it. They walked past it in this process. Third class passenger Minnie Couts was actually given a life jacket by a steward, shown to the lifeboats with her two sons, and the last thing that he told her was pray for me. And Steward Dean Cox repeatedly led third-class passengers from the bows of the ship up into the boat deck. So while many of the passengers were kept below decks, we did have a few individuals who made sure that they were trying to get to safety. But other things are contributing to this. We need to talk about additional causes and we need to talk about additional effects with this. So it's more than just the gates that are keeping people behind. Titanic is huge. Titanic is 882.5 feet long, which in modern times is super small. And even at the time that Titanic left for her maiden voyage, she had been upserved as far as the largest vessel. The French line had introduced the Île-de-France, which was now the largest vessel in the world. And so you have this gigantic ship, and it's a maze of corridors. They're all whitewashed. They're all paneled. How many of us have gotten lost on campus? And there's some semblance of difference within the buildings. If all you have is just white corridors, is everything going to start looking the same? Yes. Is it going to be this mass craze of just one corridor after another? And if you have 2 hours and 40 minutes before this ship sinks, what is the possibility of snaking your way through these corridors? It's difficult. Things that make things even worse is this is a British-built ship, which means every sign is going to be in English. And many of our immigrants, do they speak English? No. So if every single sign on campus was printed in Dutch, how well would we fare?
Still be lost.
We'd still be lost. Even with the signs printed in English, we're still lost. Exactly. So most of these signs are printed in English. Many of our immigrant passengers do not understand English, so they're staring at these signs that make no sense. Even though it's directing them to the boats, they have no idea what it actually says. Those that are lucky enough to have brought an English dictionary with them now have to fumble through the dictionary to find out what this says. And does that take precious time? It does, yes. Other things that we need to take into consideration is as this event begins to progress over the course of the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, more and more and more of these passages become blocked by personal belongings. Many of the immigrants have carried everything with them from their home country. And many of them are carrying it through these corridors as this ship is sinking. And as the decks begin to slant even more, as lights begin to flicker, as you hear this horrendous groaning of Titanic strained steel, is eventually that suitcase, is it no longer going to have any importance to you? Are you eventually going to dump it in the hallway? Is everyone else going to eventually dump their suitcases in the hallway? Are we now going to have this congestion in corridors of just abandoned belonging? Is it going to make us difficult for us to actually move throughout this more? So there are many causes to this, and there are also many causes behind the rationale of the stewards who are keeping these individuals locked behind gates. Most of them are not aware of the severity of the situation. No one, with the exception of Captain Smith, the officers, Thomas Andrews, and the carpenter, are aware of exactly what is going on. And Smith makes the decision not to spread word about this because he does not want to start a panic. So for many of these stewards, if you don't think that anything severe is going on, what's the point in opening the gates? But many of them are also following laws, and we're going to talk about the laws next. And there's also prejudice that builds into this as well too. So let's talk about the gates. Let's talk about the laws behind this. So why were there gates? You can thank Congress for this, actually. So in 1882, the United States Congress passes what's known as the U.S. Passenger Act of 1882. During this time period, ships are getting insanely large. We're going to talk about this in a lot of detail in a couple more slides. And so they're starting to see the conditions of ships' accommodation, specifically in third class, plummet significantly. So Congress steps in and Congress passes this law, and it has multiple sections to it. Most of it is geared towards improving the accommodations of steerage so that they have better facilities. Section 1 of the Passenger Acts demands that every ship provide every immigrant at least 100 cubic feet so that they have room in this process. For safety, it demands that our bunks be kept at no higher than 2 tiers, because if any of us have ever slept in a bunk bed, you know the importance of not having anything beyond this, in essence. Section 2 dictates that single men and single women need to be segregated from each other. And oftentimes, this results in single women being housed with families. Section 7 also feeds into this as well, too. It forbids any male crew members from visiting single female quarters without any sort of precursor. We kind of know where we're going to go with that. Section 3 requires proper ventilation, but Section 3 also requires 2 distinct things. The first thing is daily medical inspections. So as you board the ship, you have to go through the company's medical inspector, and they will inspect you for any potential disease. And the reason that they do this is not only is this part of our law, but when Ellis Island comes into existence in 1892, we also see Ellis Island start putting stricter regulations on this. So if you're a shipping line and you transport an individual and they end up in Ellis Island and they find out that they are physically ill, it is your responsibility as a shipping line to ship them back to the port of origin. We're a business. Is that lost revenue? Yes. And as a business, do we want to do any of that? Absolutely not in this process, which means we have these daily health inspections to make sure that every passenger is healthy so that if they do end up on Ellis Island, we're already going to ship them back. We don't have to incur those costs. The other thing we see in Section 3 as well, too, is per this law, per Congress, third-class passengers must be segregated from everyone else by gates and other barriers to prevent the spread of infectious diseases. At this time, our immigrants are viewed as disease-riddled. Even today, our immigrants are viewed as disease-riddled, in essence. So, what happens in this process is, per this Passenger Act, the stipulation is any vessel that lands in an American port who is not abiding by any of these sections has to transport everyone, passengers and crew, back to the port of origin at their own expense. As a shipping line, as a company, as a business, is this a really bad thing? Yes. Are you now having to pay for everyone's voyage back? Are you going to have to now pay for food and other supplies to restock the vessel before you turn around and go back to your port of origin? Once they land, are your passengers going to be very happy? When you get kicked off a flight, are we usually really happy about this? No. Do we usually demand a refund? And if you have 2,000 plus passengers who have all been shipped back to their port of origin, is that a lot of refunds? Insane amount of refunds. So as a company, are you going to make sure that you do everything in your power to abide by these regulations? Are you going to make sure that your employees do everything in their power to abide by these regulations? So if many of our stewards don't know that the ship is sinking, or most of our stewards already informed by their superiors, you already keep them behind locked gates. Because we need to make sure that we abide by this regulation. So are they pretty much just following orders? They are. But there is other things that feed into this. We want to talk about more causes because there are more causes to this process. We want to talk about xenophobia. So during this time period, we see this massive rise of anti-immigrant sentiments. It starts in 1845 with the Irish and the Irish potato famine, and it progresses significantly. In the 1880s, we see this with the Jews. In the 1900s, we see this with the Italians, and it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And part of the process of this has to do with the types of immigrants that are coming over and the number of immigrants that are coming over during this time period. So before 1900, do you know how many immigrants crossed the Atlantic on average?
It wasn't a record.
What is it? There are records. Before 1900, we have about 150,000 immigrants per year coming across the Atlantic. Do you know what this number shoots up to in 1900? 1 million. And it remains at 1 million until 1921 when Congress put strict regulations on the number of immigrants that we can have. Many of these immigrants are coming from the impoverished regions of Europe. They're coming from Greece. They're coming from Romania. They're coming from Italy. They are coming from all of these different regions. And for most of us as a nation, how are we viewing them? We view them poorly. Yes. And so we start to see this rise of extreme xenophobia during this. In 1896, Ellis Island locks up 531 Italian immigrants for months in cages before they put them on boats and send them back. And the New York Tribune describes them like this: a forlorn-looking group, restless, depressed, degraded, and penniless. It is pitiful indeed to watch their longing looks, hoping against hope as they do for freedom. The most sympathetic, however, could but exclaim, as they look upon the group, "We don't want them, send them back." So this extreme xenophobia is not only building itself within the nations, but is our ship sort of a representation of society as to begin with? Are we going to see xenophobia in the way that this occurs? And this is another reason why third class gets locked below. It's more than just the regulations passed by Congress. It's more than just the difficulty of finding boats. A lot of it also has to do with xenophobia. Stewart James Johnson testified at both of the court hearings that he saw a group of his fellow crew members round up the a la carte restaurant staff. There are 68 of them total. Most of them hail from France and most of them hail from Italy. They lock them in their cabins and they expect them to drown. 3 of them survive in this process. And a lot of it feeds from this xenophobia. These types of individuals from France, individuals from Italy are viewed as degenerates, and they're viewed as going to cause issues. In fact, during the inquiries, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe ended up talking about how he fired his gun into the air to warn off a group of individuals who looked like they were going to jump into his lifeboat. And do you know the justification for why he thought that they were going to cause harm? They were immigrants. So he said that they were a group of Italian immigrants who glared more like wild beasts ready to spring. Lowe's comment made such an issue that the Royal Embassy of Italy demanded an apology during these court hearings. And the argument that they made was, outside of their outward appearance, how did you know they were Italian? So we have this extreme xenophobia that's also feeding into this process. But we also need to talk about something else as well, too. And it's this idea of classism. So in 1066, England gets conquered by France, and France ends up bringing this idea of feudalism into the equation. And we know our history. What is feudalism? King and queen. Does it set up an extreme hierarchical system? Yes. Does it set up an extremely rigid, inflexible hierarchical system? If your grandfather was poor, is your father going to be poor? Are you going to be poor? Are your children going to be poor? Is there any ability of social movement in this? Marriage, but is a land-holding aristocrat really going to marry a serf? Maybe if they want to fight their parents. We see this in things like the Duchess of Malfi from Marlowe and things during Elizabethan literature. So what happens in this process is we have, beginning in the 11th century, this stringent feudalistic system. Everyone is locked within their box, and no one moves from this box. Which means we need to talk about our cultural context again. This is kind of difficult for us as Americans to understand because are we kind of built on this idea of social mobility? Freedom in this process. It's difficult for us to look at the fact that for most of our third-class passengers, they were raised in this concept that you were born poor and you were part of the lower class. You were inferior, which meant who had rights to the boats? Rich people. Did you have the ability to question that? Did your station allow you to question that? So oftentimes people have this issue with dealing with the sort of perceived complacency of our third class. Many of them just accepting their fate and dying. But we have to take into consideration that it's this centuries-old concept of classism that's feeding into this. Many of them did not think they have the right to do this. The right is a very American kind of ideology in this process. So we want to make sure that we gather up all of our causes and effects. So let's talk about our second cause and effect. Go back to our lifeboats. Why were there not enough lifeboats, in essence? So let's talk about what's going on during this time period. So in August of 1889, we have what is the Naval Review at Spithead. And so Edward VII is invited his cousin from Germany, and he wants to sort of flex his muscle. And so what he decides is he's going to line up all of these British naval cruisers, and he's also invited White Star Line, Titanic's owners, to bring some of their vessels in. And the entire process is Edward VII wanting to sort of say, look at all of these amazing boats that we have. And if you decide to invade us, look at all of these amazing boats that we have. Does it go according to plan? No, it doesn't. So the Kaiser is walking around, he's looking at all these vessels. He's not really impressed with all of these naval vessels, but he's super impressed with these White Star Liners. He's impressed with the luxury of them. And he turns to his accompaniment and he says, we need this. And they go back to Germany and they establish Hamburg America and they establish Norddeutscher Lloyd. And so what we start to see is this extreme rivalry between Britain's Cunard and White Star and Germany's two shipping lines. They engage in this Freudian match for who can create the largest, the fastest, the most opulent ship. In 1897, Hamburg America launches Kaiser Wilhelm, which is 655 feet long. A decade later, Cunard launches Lusitania and Mauritania, which are over 100 feet longer than this. 5 years later, right? How many years later? I don't do math. 4 years later, White Star Line launches Olympic and Titanic, which are almost 100 feet longer than Lusitania and Mauritania. It's this insane competition among shipping lines to create the largest, the fastest, the most opulent ships possible. And immigration feeds into this. We talked about the number. By 1900, we have 1 million immigrants. Is this a huge target audience? Is this huge revenue? The bigger your ship, the more immigrants you can carry in this process. So what ends up happening is in 1894, the British Board of Trade, which sets regulations for these ships, gets annoyed with this process. Every couple of years, they have to revamp their regulations. And if we know anything about government bureaucracy, is it just a simple fix? No. It takes 10 years to fix something that we had an issue 20 years ago, in essence, right? There's meetings, there's forms, there's all of this stuff. So the British Board of Trade is trying to keep pace with all of this. And in 1894, the British Board of Trade pretty much says, you know what, we're done. We're done. Every year, these things get bigger and bigger. Every year, we have to have a meeting. Every year, we have to change the laws. Here's the rule. Any ship that is over 10,000 tons, 16 lifeboats. Do what you want to do with that. Titanic had 20. Titanic had 4 more than what was legally required of her. And it's easy to go, oh, well, that was just White Star Line's negligence, but historian Walter Lohr did a survey of all ships in 1912, British and German. And of the 33, or of the 39 that he looked at, 33, which were over 10,000 tons, had enough lifeboats for less than half of the people on board. Because that was what was legally required of them. Well, Cunard's Carmania was the worst. Cunard had space for 29 people on board. Yes, you read that right. Yes. 29% of those on board. So, it all had to do with laws, in essence. White Star Line was providing 4 more lifeboats than they legally had to provide at this point, which is why many historians talk about how this event was inevitable. Had it not been Titanic, maybe it would have been Olympic. Maybe it would have been Lusitania. Maybe it would have been Kaiser Wilhelm. Maybe it would have been our lovely little Carmania. That these outdated regulations were setting up everything for failure. Titanic just happened to be the ship that this happened to. But eventually, something were to happen, and it would have resulted in the same exact consequence. So this is why there are too few lifeboats. This is why we need to talk about the cause and effect. It's more than just White Star Line not giving a care. It has to do with the regulations themselves in this process. And just sort of bureaucratic ineptitude, in essence. Because should the Board of Trade have just given up in 1894? Should they have kept pace with it as much as they did not like the process? Yes, exactly. That would have been the safe thing to do, and that would have been the smart thing to do in this process. So we want to read things within the cause and effect. So let's start talking about our third technique for improving information literacy. Or not. All right, we're all done. Go.
That earlier than it.
So our third one is the importance of complete data. So there are certain pieces of information, certain data sets that have clear, concrete data to them. At what point does water freeze? 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius, right? However, there are certain data points that have multiple components to them. So if I told you that a diet high in broccoli contributes to a longer life, is that as cut and dry as water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius? Is there some more to this in this process? What other things contribute to it? How much broccoli are we talking about? Are we talking about an ungodly amount? Am I going to get sick? Are we talking about in addition to exercise? Are we talking about in addition to low fat? What else is in this? So when it comes to us as scholars, as us as just individuals, we want to make sure that not only are we reporting all of our data, but we are also getting all of our data in this process. So let's say that I do a survey of all of us here in this room and on WebEx, and I ask us, do we like broccoli? And 38% of us say, I hate broccoli. It's absolutely disgusting. I don't want to touch it. And that's where I end my research. I say 38% of people hate broccoli. What is wrong with this? One, it's too small of a sampling, so we want to take into consideration our biases in this process. Selection bias, experimenter bias. Yes, definitely.
Doesn't explain how it affects higher lifespan.
Yeah, it doesn't explain this at all. Are we missing pieces of this too? 38%. Are we missing 64% of my numbers? Am I not giving my full data set? No. So if I gave you my full data set, we could find out that maybe 42% that say they love broccoli. 12% said they really don't care either way. And 8% say, I don't even know what broccoli is. I've never tried it. So why is it important that we give the entire data set itself and that we get the entire data set as scholars?
Bias as much as possible.
It eliminates bias as much as possible, because if I use this for my research and said 38% of all people hate broccoli, therefore everyone hates broccoli and they should no longer sell it at King Soopers. Is my data tainted? Is my argument tainted at this point? And as readers, would you get the full story of this? No. So we need all of our data points, but we also need to understand how different ways of looking at our data can impact this. So if I just did a sweeping survey and I just asked all of us, do we like broccoli or do we not like broccoli? I might get one set of results. But what if I broke this down by age? And I said, anyone over a certain amount of age, you're one group. And is that going to give me completely different results? Well, I see different data, different trends, different implications in this. What if I break it down by income? Because broccoli can be expensive, right? Fresh fruits and vegetables, which is why we talk about things like, food deserts. So if you have a very poor income, you might not be interested in broccoli because you have to spend your money on other things in this case. So the way that we look at our data is going to impact all of this. So let's look at two more examples with Titanic, and let's look at this. Let's look at the unthinkable aspect of this. This is the thing that we talk about a lot, right? So in 1981, journalist Philip Howard did a study, and he looked through all of the British newspapers that he could possibly find, and he tried to find evidence that prior to the sinking, Titanic was billed as unsinkable or practically unsinkable. And this is what Howard states. He says, I cannot find no contemporary evidence that Titanic was regarded as virtually unsinkable until after she had sunk. With hindsight, we have created the myth because it makes more dramatic metaphor. So we talk about the importance of complete data. So with Howard, there is a yes, but there's missing data in this case. In 1910, White Star Line published a publicity pamphlet for Olympic and Titanic that said, as far as it is possible to do so, these two beautiful or wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable. A year later, the shipbuilder ended up publishing an article that the Belfast Morning News and the Irish News ended up publishing again in 1911, later on that year, that said, in the event of accident, or at any time when it may be considered advisable, the captain can, by simply moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout and make the vessel practically unsinkable. So practically unsinkable, as far as it is possible to do so. Are we having some issues with what Howard is saying? Is there some contemporary evidence that's showing this? In 1910, the Liverpool Journal flat out says, Olympic and Titanic unsinkable by reason of electrically controlled watertight doors. Further safety provided by wireless telegraphy. Is Howard missing some of his data set? But is Howard also kind of alluding to something else? Because there is a yes but in this. This second sentence. Howard is kind of right about this. So while many of our publicity pamphlets for the ships prior to their sailings build them as practically unsinkable, as far as possible to do so, or just flat out unsinkable, we don't start to see Titanic as unsinkable, kind of as Howard talks about, until April 15th, 1912. This is where things like this begin to appear in newspapers throughout. So while Howard has a part of the information, Howard does not have all of the information, which means we need to understand getting all of our data sets. But to put things in context, because we're going to continue to build off of what we've been talking about, we want to look at what's going on historically. Hamburg, America, Kaiser Wilhelm. How do you think that they built Kaiser? Practically unsinkable. Cunard builds Lusitania and Mauritania as practically unsinkable. If we know our history, what happens to Lusitania? Lusitania sinks, May of 1915. Ugly sinking in this process. The Royal Navy builds their new battleship, the Audacious, as practically unsinkable. If we know our nautical history, we know what happens to Audacious. It sinks during World War I. So it's not just White Star that's doing this. At this era, which goes back to what we talked about, do our Edwardians have sort of a blind confidence in technology? Is this idea that everything is practically unsinkable part of that blind confidence portion? Yes. So we want to make sure that we're getting all of our data points, which builds us into our next thing. Oops. What's Titanic speeding? At the time of the collision, Titanic was going 22.5 knots. The day before, first class passenger Elizabeth Lyons talked about how at tea, she overheard Ismay, who was managing director of White Star Line, arguing with Captain Smith about increasing Titanic speed to the Olympics maiden voyage. So here we have another yes, but in this process. So let's go back to our heated competition. Let's go back to our Freudian matches. So there is what's referred to as the blue ribbon. And every year, companies that have the fastest ship are given the blue ribbon. It's this note of distinction. And competitions between the ships become so nasty that in 1907, when Hamburg, America has to hand over the blue ribbon to Cunard, their managing director makes an entire spectacle of it. Horrible comments about Cunard. It gets ugly in this process. And so by the beginning of the 1900s, White Star Line is kind of getting dissatisfied with this insane competition. So by around 1900, White Star Line steps out of the speed competition. And White Star Line starts to establish itself as building the largest ships and most opulent ships possible. This becomes something that distinguishes the line until 1934, when they merge with Cunard. White Star Line becomes world famous for the insane amount of customer service and luxury that they provide their passengers. And the mentality that they have with this is we may not be able to get you across the Atlantic in 5 days, like Hamburg, America, or Cunard. It might take us 2 extra days, 3 extra days, but we are going to pamper you with so much luxury, you won't care at that point. And it becomes a stamp that makes White Star Line famous. It also makes White Star Line famous for being one of the most brutal employers on the North Atlantic run. Because if you have ridiculously high customer service standards, any of us who have ever worked retail or restaurant service, do those standards usually filter down to the workers? Yes. White Star Line was known for being an extremely brutal employer to their employees. If you're ever interested, Violet Jessup, who was a stewardess aboard Olympic, Titanic, and several other White Star liners, talked about how they were her last option. She went and employed for work at every other steamship company she possibly could and held out for White Star at the very end because she heard horror stories. She got turned down by every single job, and White Star Line was the last ditch option. So White Star Line was much more concerned with size and with luxury. They were not really concerned with speed. They exited that competition because it started to get very, very, very disgusting. So we need to look at all of our data sets. We need to talk about the yes, but portion of this. Yes, Elizabeth Lyons overheard Smith demanding that Titanic speed be increased. Yes, Titanic was traveling at 22.5 knots at the time that she struck the iceberg, which is roughly 26 miles per hour, which really doesn't seem much at all. Many of you traveling up Thatcher to get here were going much faster than this, whether you're willing to admit it or not. And so Olympic and Titanic's actual physical anatomy prevented them from going any faster than 23 knots. It's claimed that in 1915, Olympic went 24.2 knots during World War I, but many nautical historians think that this was an exaggeration by White Star Line's vice president to bolster up some things. Any other crossing, the fastest we'd ever seen Olympic get was 23.4 knots. So these ships were not built for speed. They were big, they were bulky, they could not go very fast. We also need to take into consideration other things, other data points. At the time of Titanic sailing, there was a massive coal strike, which significantly decreased the amount of fuel. In fact, White Star Line had to cancel several other crossings of their other ships and transfer not only passengers, but coal to Titanic so that she could make the voyage from Southampton to New York. And even then, that was with fingers crossed, because technically she didn't have enough coal. And so if you have limited fuel, is it a wise decision to go speeding at breakneck speed? Probably not. Do you have the potential to run out of fuel at some point? Are your passengers going to be super happy? No, they're going to want refunds. And how's that going to look to you as a company as well, too? Your flagship, your brand new vessel has to get towed on its maiden voyage because you ran out of coal. It doesn't look great. But we also need to look at nautical standards of the era. In both the American and the British inquiries, several captains were brought in to testify about how ships were ran in fields of ice. And every single captain told both the American and the British inquiries that it was common practice in that era to speed at full speed through ice fields until you saw ice. We have to talk about context again, because all of us are going, this is stupid. At that time, we have this blind confidence in technology. And if you have a blind confidence in technology, is this going to lead you to believe that anything large enough to sink a ship you're probably going to see in time? So speeding through an ice field, will you most likely see something large enough to sink you? Yes. So many nautical captains talked about how what Captain Smith was doing was just standard practice. Speeding towards top speed through an ice field was what you were instructed to do as a captain of that era. So while Titanic was, yes, speeding, we need to look at the full data. Titanic could not go any further than 23 knots. Olympic pushed it with 23.4. Too little coal meant that we ran out of fuel too early in the voyage. And this was kind of common practice in this era. So let's look at our fourth and final information literacy thing. Let's talk about splitting truth from fiction. We live in an age now of a lot of extreme misinformation. You get it on TikTok, you get it from your crazy aunts who go on these weird tangents. You get it from everyone. And so why is it important for us, not just now, but just as a society as a whole, to understand how to divide the two?
In order to make sense of the world.
Yes, to make sense of the world. We want to make sure that we're getting the full picture, right? We want to make sure that we're not being lied to, we're not being manipulated in this process. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are separating this. So conspiracies are anywhere from history into science. And psychologists have been looking at this for a long time. Some of the earliest studies came from the 1960s. So 1965, Alport and Postman ended up doing research on the 1947 Roswell crash. And they looked at the conspiracies of aliens surrounding this. And what they found in this process is that not only with our Roswell crash, but with most conspiracies and rumors, there's some semblance of truth. Why would it be important that there be a truth to it? Makes it believable, right? We have something to graph onto. It makes it sound like it's actually plausible. So what Alport and Postman found is that in most rumors and in most conspiracies, there is some semblance of truth. Sociologist Bossart talks about how oftentimes we see the rise of conspiracies during moments of uncertainty. War, famine, all of these things. When we as a society are desperate for answers, we will cling on to anything and everything we possibly can to make sense of it in this process. Which means we as individuals, not just as scholars, but we as individuals need to understand where reality ends and where fantasy begins in this process. Sometimes these lines are very clear cut and we can easily identify it. The tunnels used by the workers of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company in the 1950s now house mutant species of mole people. Are there tunnels below Pueblo, Colorado that the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company were used to transport goods? Yes. Are they full of mole people? Are you sure? Have you been down there recently? All right. So we can easily see where the truth ends and the fiction begins, but sometimes that line blurs itself. Social media uses subliminal advertising to feed blind consumerism. At what point does truth end and fiction begin? It's hard for us at sometimes to decide that. So what should we be doing to help us better understand where our truth ends and where our fantasy, our conspiracy begins? No. Research, yeah, exactly. Could we be doing all of the other things that we've talked about in today's lesson? Do we need to read things within their context? Do we need to make sure that we are looking at all causes and all effects? Do we need to make sure that we are getting all data points in this process? Yes. So we want to use what we've been exploring in today's lesson to help us divide truth from fiction in this process. So let's end with one last and final example. Let's end with the Titanic conspiracy. Let's end with the most popular Titanic conspiracy. The Titanic was deliberately sank for an insurance scam. So we are going, what? This is a conspiracy theory, and in Titanic circles, you would be more than surprised to know that this thing actually has a lot of frightening weight to it. So we'll talk about where truth begins and where fantasy starts to take over. So in the middle of the 1990s, Robin Gardner and Dan van der Vat, say that 10 times, ended up proposing this idea. And so they build part of it off of truth, which is what Alport talks about earlier. So in September of 1911, Olympic collided with Hawke, which was a British naval cruiser. This was actually a regular occurrence with the Olympic class. Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic had a design flaw. They had this tendency to suck things into their propellers. Olympic sucked the Hawke into its propellers. This is the bow of the Hawke, and here's what it did to Olympic. When Titanic was leaving port in Southampton, it ended up passing New York, the ship New York, not the city, and the mooring lines ended up snapping. It sucked the New York into its propellers, and they were able to stop the collision by about a meter. During her sinking in World War I, as Britannic, the little sister, was sinking, they had loaded up all of her lifeboats, and she ended up sucking in her lifeboats into her propellers. There was a design flaw with these ships. Some architects make the argument that Harland and Wolff just kind of went big. So if we look at Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic, you're going to hate me for saying this, but they were practically unremarkable ships. All of their interiors we had already seen in other White Star liners, just bigger in essence. And that's kind of what Harland and Wolff did with them. They just went bigger. And sometimes when you go bigger, is it necessarily better? No, do things not translate well when we blow things up? And some architects make the claim that this was the problem with the suction, that just going bigger caused suction issues. So Olympic ends up sucking this British naval cruiser into her propellers. They both collide. There are 2 different court hearings to this. And if this is a British government vessel, who's gonna get blamed? Exactly, right? So the Naval Court of Inquiry blames everything on Olympic. The Admiralty Court further confirms all of this. So what happens is in October, Titanic is pulled out of her berth. Olympic is pushed into the berth and they rebuild all of the damage done to Olympic. This pushes back Titanic's maiden voyage from March 30th to April 10th. This is all true. We all know this. This is concrete truth. But let's talk about where Gardner's conspiracy starts to begin. So Gardner makes the argument that Lloyd's of London, because the British government has ruled that Olympic is truly at fault, is now refusing to pay the insurance claim on it. So White Star Line is now faced with a very stark reality. Olympic is damaged beyond repair, according to Gardner, but Titanic is a brand new vessel. Titanic is fully insurable, which means what happens to Olympic? Is Lloyd's of London going to touch it? No. So Gardner ends up saying that over the course of this time period, as Olympic is being rebuilt and Titanic is sitting in the dock, White Star Line officials decide to create a conspiracy. They decide to create insurance fraud. So they select a hand group of individuals that they can pay off. And they instruct them, the day before Olympic is expected to leave the Thompson dry dock and go back, you're going to switch the vessels. The damaged Olympic is now going to become Titanic. The brand new Titanic will now become Olympic because its insurance policy is now null and void. You send off the Titanic, you sink it, and you collect the insurance money. You have a brand new vessel. And so this is the claim that Gardner makes. So Gardner makes the claim that at some point before Olympic left the Thompson dry dock, that they switched the vessels, and then Captain Smith comes into play. So Gardner takes it further and says that Captain Smith and a small collection of crew were then paid off by White Star Line to deliberately sink the vessel on the 5th night of its voyage. They hired the Californian to dash to the rescue and rescue everybody. This is Titanic, which means that it is now fully insured, so Lloyd's of London will pay out the insurance plan. But what usually happens to the best laid plans? I'll go awry. So according to Gardner, this whole plan falls apart. Titanic does not hit an iceberg. Titanic collides with another ship, a sailing ship, which has white sails, which they think is an iceberg. The ice that falls on the deck is actually ice from the rigging of the sails. Both ships separate. Both ships send up rockets. The Californian, which has been hired to dash to the rescue, is now confused because there's rockets everywhere, and they never dash to the rescue. Titanic sinks and 1,500 people die. That's a lot. It's a lot to digest. So let's talk about the logistics of this. Let's start to deconstruct this because we've now entered the conspiracy realm. So let's just talk about the pure logistics of switching these. Both of them were 882.5 feet long. They're both 46,000 tons. They're big. Are you going to be able to just easily pick one up, put it in the dry dock, and put the other one up? You're not. Are people going to notice one leaving and the other moving in this process? Yes, so we have that logic. What are some other logics that we have that kind of punch some holes in what Gardner is claiming? Definitely.
There's like a bunch of people working on these ships. Wouldn't they all have said something by now?
That's a great point. How does that saying go? It's easy for friends to, how is it? It's easy for 3 friends to keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Do people tattle? Is this one of the reasons why it's difficult to have cover-ups and things? People eventually tattle, whether it's for money, whether it's on their deathbed trying to absolve their sins. So, as Jacqueline points out, is someone potentially going to tattle at this point? Yes.
Even just in a game,
Even today, think about it, right?
they have nothing to lose.
If you have nothing to lose, this makes for a great story. And our newspaper is going to pay a fortune for an exclusive story like this. Right. You do, right? This requires a lot of stealth in this process. But let's also talk about the workers. So Titanic has been pulled out of her dry dock and Olympic has been put into it, which meant all work on Titanic stopped. Everyone had to then move over to Olympic and rebuild the structure of Olympic that had been damaged. Are you eventually, as a worker, going to have to go back to Titanic? Is what you left when you were told to go over to Olympic going to be there? If you were working on electrical wiring, will that most likely still be there? If you went back the next day and they said, this is Titanic and the electrical wire is already fixed, some of us might be super happy because someone did our job and we probably won't tell anybody. But most of us are going to be like, something's wrong here. But let's also talk about some more. So we have the logistics of this. It's impossible to switch these ships without people noticing. Someone's eventually going to squeal. The workers are going to notice that something is up. But let's also talk about the big evidence that comes into play with this. So, Harland and Wolff used dock numbers, not the names of the ships, to identify themselves. So anything that went on that ship was stamped with its dock number to signify that it was for this ship. Here we have paneling. It tells you, it goes in the sitting room, it tells you which panel it is, it tells you which side of the deck it goes on, and it has the ship's dock number on it. Every single thing that gets put on this ship, in a Harland and Wolff ship, is going to be stamped with the dock number. So, the claim that Gardner makes is that for most of our White Star liners, they don't really put the names on anything. If you get a chance, go to the library over the course of this month and look at the flatware and the dishes and the silverware. White Star Line never put any of the ship's names on this. And the reason that they did this was it was easy to just split things out. So if all of your vessels have the same china pattern, when things get broken, you can have a storehouse in Southampton. Whatever gets broken, stewards go pick it up and they put it on the vessel. So Gardner's claim makes some sense because other than the lifeboat placards, other than things in the bridge and the chart room, nothing has Titanic's name on it. So technically you can flip these things out. But the problem with Gardner's theory is, while most visible things do not have Titanic's name on it, every single paneling will have dock numbers on the back. So in 1934, Cunard and White Star merged as a means to survive the Great Depression. And Cunard slowly ruled White Star Line out of the process. And what happens to Cunard? Cunard exists today. You can still sail on Cunard. Cunard still has Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary too, making transatlantic voyages. So in 1935, part of this phasing out process is Cunard starts scrapping most of White Star Line's vessels. And Olympic is one of these that's scrapped. And in an effort to gain more money in this process, especially during the Depression, they start to sell off and auction the interiors. Hotels buy them up as cheap means of decorations, and private homes buy them up as cheap means of decorations. The White Swan, if you ever get a chance to visit England, the White Swan is decked out floor to ceiling with Olympic. Their staircases are Olympic's forward grand staircase. They have Olympic's first class lounge. They have parts of the a la carte restaurant. They used Olympic to decorate the entire hotel. So if Gardner's theory is correct, what would the dock number? So Olympic's is dock number 400 and Titanic's is dock number 401. On all of these pieces that were sold at auction in 1935, if Gardner's theory is correct, what should the dock number be? 401. Do you know what the dock number to all of these are? 400. These are photographs from the paneling in the White Swan Hotel. Every single one of them are stamped 401. Wreckage from the Titanic, which was picked up by the Mackie Bennett, which was gathering bodies after the sinking, also gathered up debris. And do you know what is on the back of those debris pieces? 401 in this process. Yes. But despite all of this evidence, despite the logistics of it, despite evidence to the contrary, despite Bruce Beveridge and Stephen Hall writing books against Gardner's claim, this holds a lot of weight in subgroups of the Titanic community. And a lot of people in the Titanic community believe that this was an insurance scam. Some of them don't take it as far as it did not hit an iceberg, it was a sailing vessel, but many of them claim White Star Line deliberately switched these vessels. Gardner published a follow-up book in 1998, and there isn't even a documentary produced in 2012 about this. If you have Tubi, it is available on Tubi for free for you to watch. You can listen to the argument that they make and take into consideration what we've talked about today. So understanding the difference between fact and fiction and where our line draws. So when it comes to improving our information literacy skills, we want to read things in context. We want to make sure that we're not taking things out of their social context, their historical context, or even the context of the text itself. We want to make sure that we are getting all causes and effects, not just one. We want to make sure that we are getting all data points. And we want to use these technologies, these techniques, to make sure that we separate truth from fiction in this case. No idea what time I'm at. Is it really? Right. Thank you all for taking this little journey with me. Hopefully you found it interesting. I know I'm sorry that we didn't do a Titanic 101, but next year, maybe, if you are interested in a Titanic 101, we might do something like that. Any questions before I move? Do we have time for 5:03?
Up to you. You have a class to get to.
All right, I have a class at 5:30, so we'll take maybe 15 minutes of questions. Yes.
How many the post have, like, the fit that on the.
In order to fit everyone on board, it would have to have had roughly 25 or more lifeboats in that process. But that's to house the 2,228 on that voyage. So it would have needed twice the amount that it would have already had. Good question. All right.
The conspiracies that they believe now, what I'm curious, was that propaganda or used in a legal battle between the British and the Starlight or the company? But nobody believed it at the time.
No one believed it at the time. In fact, if you look at the lawsuits that came against White Star Line during that period, all of them were for loss of property, which is something unique because in today's time, if we had this massive loss of life, there would be wrongful death suits left and right. No one sued for loss of life. Everyone sued for loss of property. And so some legal historians make the argument that it was just a mindset at that time. In 1912, it was kind of considered vulgar to put a price tag on a loved one. So they sued for property, not that. Any other questions? Well,
How long have you been interested in the Titanic?
Few days.
a few days. Yesterday. Yesterday. I hate to admit this, 30 years.
All
Alright, so it was, a question was brought to me, to ask.
Okay.
And it's another conspiracy theory question.
Yes.
What prominent families did not get on that ship that were supposed to be on that ship?
Ah, okay. So that feeds into there are many conspiracy theories with Titanic. One of them is that there was a German spy on board the ship that deliberately sank Titanic as a competition between Germany and Britain. And some of them make the argument that this was sort of like a precursor to World War I. There's another conspiracy theory that says that J.P. Morgan deliberately sank the vessel because John Jacob Astor and a few other wealthy individuals who were pushing for a standard bank were on board that ship. J.P. Morgan was the most famous one that did not take the voyage. Ismay's wife did not take the voyage as well too. Gardner makes the claim that it was because that she knew what was going on. I tend to align myself with other historians, and they just pretty much say that the explanation is probably a lot more simple than that. This woman is the wife of a managing director. She would have had to go on the maiden voyage of every single ship this company had. Would you really want to go on another one? Would you probably find an excuse? Yes. So some historians just make the argument she was tired of this at this point. She'd already gone on dozens of these maiden voyages. She just wanted an excuse to get out of it. Yes.
Is there a record of how much coal was lost in the fire, given it already had a depleted fuel?
That's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that. There may be, if there's not a record, you could probably do some reverse mathematics, look at how much coal Titanic consumed, how much coal that she was actually loaded with, and do, but no, we should, yeah, figure out what's missing in essence, yes. I wish I had an answer for that, but I don't.
How many of the conspiracy theories do you believe? Are any that you particularly believe?
We kind of looked at the switch theory. I really don't believe in that. That it was deliberately sank by a German spy. The biggest reason that I don't believe that was, does anyone play video games? Has anyone played Titanic Adventure Out of Time? There's a 1996 video game, and that is the plot to the video game. Is you are you are a British intelligence officer, and you were supposed to stop this German spy from sinking the ship, in essence. So that's one of the reasons I don't believe it. It's a video game. That's probably where that came from to begin with. But yeah, no, I don't really buy that one. I don't buy into the whole.
Doctor Who did it too.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. They did the Christmas special. Yes, exactly.
So if you were going to recommend one book or place to look for information that's a summary of the history of the Titanic, it would be.
I would recommend Walter Lord's A Night to Remember. And the reason that I recommend Walter Lord's A Night to Remember is, although it's an older work, it was written in the 40s and the 50s, Walter Lord actually went out and interviewed all of the survivors and then took what they told him and compiled his book. So he took all of those primary sources and used those to weave together the narrative itself. So I would recommend Lord's.
I'll just say I was making comparisons where you were describing facing the ocean, like just assuming you were going to die. It made me compare it to like the event we went through in our own history of 9/11.
Yes.
Like if they face either going downstairs or just sitting there and something falls apart.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah. That's a great point, Brian. Like, it's very similar to that. Like you're faced with this very stark decision. Like, do I try to make it down? Do I jump? Like, what do I do in this process? Thankfully, none of us have ever been put in that type of situation, and I hope none of you are ever put in that type of situation where you have to face those types of nasty, real-world decisions. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you for spending your afternoon with me.
Thank you, Professor. I continued in the car. I had to go pick up Laura May, but thank you so much.
So if you do get a chance, stop by the PCC Library. It's going to be on display the entire month, so you can look at all of those things. I highly recommend that you do that. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very interesting lecture.
Thank you, Glenn.
So, you're in the moment. Yeah, okay.
Initiative.